Hello there and good afternoon. Welcome once again to our Ukraine War Q&A with Professor Michael Clarke. You actually caught us there. We were in the middle of a big old talk. We might come back to some of that, Michael, as the viewers joined, because I think they will be interested as well in some of that targeting of cruise missiles and how accurate these missiles are. Thank you again, as always, for submitting your questions prior to us beginning this. Remember, you can submit some questions as we go along. And today we're going to take a slight left turn. I don't know if that's the right way of describing this. We're going to talk about the Chinese military parade as well, that I'm sure many of you will have watched overnight, the implications for that towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and just what we saw as well, and get the good professor's take on it, which is always necessary. So let's kick off. We've got a question here from Beauvoir, and it's about the military parade, Michael. What major changes do you envisage to the world order? Is the China summit and what we've seen subsequently a glimpse of the future? Is a new axis forming?
Well, that's exactly what the leaders in Beijing would like the world to think. And it is a great photo opportunity of exactly that. I mean, here are a group of leaders who are predominantly anti-Western in their orientation, who explicitly say we reject the power that the West has had over global politics, and it is changing. That's what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And the political message behind everything that Xi Jinping has done for this this grand event, this 80th anniversary, has pursued that course. It's actually stuck to that. And there he is with President Putin and Kim Jong-un and Lukashenko, who was there in the front rank as they ambled forward towards the Tiananmen
I saw that walking
gate
up a slope, dabbing his brow, and I thought, how warm is it? It's 33 degrees, so it is pretty warm, but he doesn't look like he's a man in great shape.
There were three flights of stairs to get to the top, and after each flight, when they got to the landing, they all stopped. Because
they're all old
dictators. They all needed a breather. And then they went to the next one and stopped. Then the next one. I mean, I think there was Camp 1, Camp 2, and Camp 3 before they got to the top.
Really, for base camp to the very top.
for the viewing stand. But anyway, there they are. Now they intend it to be a new world order. And the war in Ukraine, in Putin's rhetoric, has gone through three phases that we've talked about before. I mean, one phase, it was Russia's imperial expansion. Russia, this territory belongs to Russia, so we're taking it. That was the first phase. Then it became, we are protecting the Russian motherland from the external world which is trying to conquer us. Mm-hmm. And then Putin became an ideologue for global transformation. That the Ukraine war is the front line in the battle for global transformation to diminish the stranglehold of the West on free peoples everywhere and release the world to a world of freedom under the watchful eye of these great brutal dictatorships. Mm-hmm. So I think there's two. I mean, I get this sort of question all the time in the other work I do and the lectures I do and so on. And I think there's three possibilities here. I mean, the worst possibility is that they are right and that what we saw today is a presage of the future. Mm-hmm. And that what we'll have within 20-odd years, or maybe more than that, well, maybe less than that, maybe 10 years, will be a world dominated by aggressive, dictatorial, expansionist powers. Because the power of the United States is just draining away. Whatever you think about President Trump, internally, whatever is the outcome of the MAGA republicanism inside America, mm-hmm. Any sensible analyst will tell you American power is just draining away in the world, in Africa, across Asia, in Latin America even, just draining away. And China is sweeping up that power, and Russia is in the wake of China. Mm-hmm. So that's one outcome, a dictatorial, expansionist world, which would be pretty bad for all the rest of us. A second version of that is, and I think it's the more likely one, is extreme multipolarity, that the world is going to become far more chaotic. And that will be as much of a problem to Beijing and Moscow as it is presently to Washington or London, Paris or Berlin. And that world is going to be more fractured, more fragmented, more chaotic, and it won't be dominated only by the dictatorships. And within that world is a third possibility, which would be the best one for us, is that within 20-odd years, the liberal democracies are able to preserve what's important, are able to defend themselves, and that the world will want to come back to the sort of liberal democracy model that we presently find is slipping away. Mm-hmm. And that would be the best outcome for us. But it's going to be a rocky road to get there. Yeah. But that's the only one that's feasible for us. But I mean, that's where we're going. And, and it comes back to when the Cold War ended in 1991, the liberal democracies thought, well, that's wonderful. We've done it.
End of history.
We've succeeded. End of history. After this, the world will be dominated by the degree of adaptation to liberal democracy. How quickly and in what ways does everybody adjust to the default option, which is liberal democracy? When all else fails, when communism fails, when fascism fails, then you end up back at liberal democracy, giving people individual freedom to determine their own futures. And that hasn't been the case over the last 30-odd years. And of course, the appalling prospect is that whereas we think of the 20th century was the century of the triumph of liberal democracy over Bolshevism, over fascism, and then over later communism, it was the triumph of liberal democracy. The 21st century may see the end of liberal democracy. And the 21st century may emerge as the century of dictatorial expansionism and really nasty world politics, and that's option number one that I mentioned. Very unpleasant to think about, and that at the moment looks as if we could be on that path, but it's not inevitable, and we've got to go for paths 2 and 3. Multipolarity. We've got to manage multipolarity, hold on to what's important to us, and then play it long, so that what we represent does then start to attract people around the world as being a better model for their futures.
I made a few notes about what you said there, because I do find them interesting. I mean, the first one, that first possibility about autocracy, is something I think many have written about. Anne Applebaum's written a book on this, done a podcast series on it called Autocracy Inc. And as you were saying, I wondered, you said, this is going to be the autocracies around the world. I mean, the United States, with Donald Trump in power, may well have seen himself within that mould of being quite dictatorial.
And that book, it's a very good book by Anne Applebaum. I have to say, I don't agree with Anne Applebaum on lots of things, but she's very, very good. And I really agree with the Autocracy Inc. The most important thing is the Inc. bit in the title, because she's saying that it's not just that the autocrats exist in the world, but now they've formed a sort of a network. Even though they don't have all that much in common, they have enough in common by trying to undermine the present global order, which is fraying at the edges in every direction. And that's what it's an ink. It has become an incorporated. And it starts to look a little bit like, a James Bond novel, Smersh. There's a group of people who are simply devoted.
Spectre.
Spectre. Yeah. Sorry, not Smersh. Smersh was the other one, wasn't it? Spectre, that's right. And so it begins to look a bit like that, because these governments, who have nothing otherwise in common, will get together if they can somehow undermine the current world order.
Well, that kind of leads us on to the second, doesn't it? Extreme multipolarity. I mean, I always refer back to this when we have these conversations. When Putin and Xi met back in 2023, I've got the clip in front of me here. The mic picks up their goodbye, and Xi says to Putin, we're going to bring in changes not seen for 100 years, and then they part ways. Putin gets into his limousine. It's just that idea that these guys are so cognizant of the fact that what they are doing right now is going to change the world.
They think history is turning, the wheel of history turning very quickly. And I mean, they thought that anyway. They thought it much more because Ukraine actually created a lot of new thinking, and the election of Donald Trump they see as their opportunity, because they've got an America now in retreat from the rest of the world, America that wants to play a different role. America is now a revisionist power, just as they are revisionist powers trying to revise the rules of the game. America is also a revisionist power trying to change the way the whole of the international system works. I.e., we're not going to stand beside it. We're not going to underpin it with all of the structural power advantages that they had. I mean, America is giving away all these advantages that it spent 150 years building up, really subtle advantages, and it's giving them all away, for free. And the Chinese saying, "Thank you very much, we'll take it up. We'll take it up." And so they see that the Trump administration as their opportunity in global terms. Now, as I say, whether Trump is seen as succeeding or failing domestically is something that we'll only discover in a few years' time. But internationally, the trend is pretty clear.
Yeah, and just final point then on the liberal democracy. I actually wrote the word naivety and I underlined it, because I do wonder if we are going to see the world turn that way. And I wonder what lessons people like you take from the Arab Spring, where we thought that was going to be the moment where we saw democracy spread across the Arab world, and look where we find ourselves in that part of the world now.
Yeah, that was 2011, wasn't it? And it all began in December the 17th, 2010, when a seller, a street seller in Tunisia, he set fire to himself because he was so angry with the government. And suddenly, because of mobile phones, that went viral. and suddenly everyone was angry with their governments. And there was that sense, this is people taking back control. Well, those of us in the political community said, well, be very careful about this, because when revolutions take place, always, and this goes back 200 or 300 years, always, the hardliners then come in. Hardliners, whether the religious hardliners, political hardliners, left-wingers, right-wingers, the hardliners come in and they kick the liberals out.
Right.
Because the liberals are not ruthless enough. The liberals believe in listening to people, and the hardliners simply take the situation on. That's exactly what has happened as a result of the Arab Spring. The whole thing turns. So that when you create a revolution, you've got to be really careful how you organise it and how you stage it. And to be honest, slow revolutions or fast evolutions are a lot better than these uprisings. Uprisings are always taken over by the hardliners, whoever they might be.
I don't think I'd ever get a revolutionary advice from Professor Michael Clarke, but there you have it. Thank you very much, Professor. Let's move on.
Yeah.
A question here from Wisdom, who talks about what we've seen on the streets of Beijing. He said, marching troops in excellent formation like a dance routine doesn't mean they're excellent soldiers. Believe me. Probably an ex-soldier here. But what can we learn from military parades, particularly from China and North Korea, where media access is so limited?
Yeah, I mean, they put a lot of effort into these parades. The Chinese want to make it look like this. And as I was saying, I mean, the parade reminded me, when I was up in the middle of the night watching the thing, it reminded me of the 2008 Beijing Olympic opening ceremony.
Yes.
It was perfect. It was perfect.
Apart from they faked the drones in the 2008
ceremony. That's right, yes.
It came out later that they weren't really drones. That was After Effects.
Yes, apparently. Yes, that's right. Yeah. But it seemed like it at the time. But I mean, the Chinese have got this reputation of doing everything to the nth degree perfectly. And you wonder, does that squash individual initiative? Does that make any difference? In military terms, of course, most military professionals will say, this is an exhibition army. We'll see how they fight. I mean, the North Koreans had an exhibition army, and they sent 13,000 of them to Kursk and lost about half of them pretty quickly. And those North Korean soldiers, they died quickly and bravely. Those who did. And that's what happens. When soldiers like this go into battle, they usually lose quite quickly and bravely. Because they obey orders, but they don't use enough initiative. So the thing about the Chinese forces is the sheer size of them is impressive. Their technical ability is impressive. What we don't know is, first of all, their battle awareness, which will be zero, because nobody in the Chinese armed forces, from top to bottom, has ever fought in a war.
The last time they fought a war was 79 in
79, a sort of skirmish war in Vietnam, which they they lost in effect.
I mean, you said that. You were a bit careful about it earlier as well. It said that they lost that fight.
Lost. I mean, they said they won it, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And they invaded a bit of North Vietnam and then withdrew from the territory and said that they'd punished the Vietnamese. And the Vietnamese said, is that the best you can do? And there was a skirmish in 1962 with India when they took a piece of Kashmir. So a piece of Kashmir is Chinese administered, still belongs to India. Before that, it was the Korean War. Now, that was a real war, but I mean, that was 75 years ago.
Completely different. Yeah.
So nobody in the Chinese armed forces knows what it is like to fight in a proper full-on campaign, or even a half-on campaign, like the war in Iraq or the operation in Afghanistan. So we would see. But you must assume, you should never underestimate your adversary in warfare. You must assume that after probably some initial problems, where they would probably lose a lot of people, they will learn quickly and they will adjust. And the sheer numbers, the sheer size of what they've got, means that only if it came out to all-out war, only the Americans could take them on, or America and allies. If it were some sort of all-out conflict, which would be close to a World War III. I mean, we're often asked about that in these sessions. Are we close to World War III? No, we say no, we're not, and we're not. But if there were a genuine all-out America-China war, that would be pretty close to World War III. Yeah. And there's a thing called the Thucydides trap. Thucydides was the great Greek historian who wrote about the antagonism between Athens and Sparta.
Yep.
And the thing that comes out of Thucydides' wonderful history is that a rising power and a declining power are almost bound to fight, because the rising power thinks that they're not getting their due, and the declining power thinks if we leave it any longer, we'll continue to decline. So the declining power tends to be aggressive as well. And there is this sort of, a lot of people have been writing about this in the last 30-odd years. Are America and China destined to fall into the Thucydides trap, where a rising power like China and a declining power like America end up going to war in the way that Athens and Sparta did? If they did, it might look a bit like World War III, It might, just as the war between Athens and Sparta destroyed classical Greece.
I mean, that was World War, wasn't it?
It was World War III for them, yeah.
All right.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't do this.
Big sigh. All right. This is a slightly more light-hearted question here, and I don't know if you know the answer, but we'll be able to make fun of a guy in his train. This is from Matt. Is Kim Jong-un scared of flying? We've seen the dictator of North Korea travelling around on his armoured train, an amazing thing. Is it because he's scared of flying? What do we know about his movement?
We know he has flown. He flew to the meeting with Donald Trump in Singapore on Air China. That was when was that? 2018.
Yeah.
And so yes, he has flown. But his father and his grandfather were very nervous about flying. Kim Jong-il, his father, he flew, I think, once, but was very worried about it. And he liked the armoured train, and he travelled to Moscow.
Because they thought that the plane would be sabotaged and it would be shot down.
The founder, Kim Il-sung, who was the original North Korean leader, he was frightened because he'd seen air crashes, and I think he was worried about the possibility of assassination.
Right.
And he developed the armoured train, which they all liked. Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, it didn't do him any good. He died on the train.
Really?
Yes.
As he was on the movement?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it was when he was on the train, he said, it's all a bit of a mystery, but he said when he finally took it, he was on the damn train. So there you are. Maybe he was feeling a bit off peak. And so the train didn't do him any good. Yeah, he died on it. But anyway, yes. And this train is so heavily armoured, it travels at about 35 miles an hour. It can't go any faster. It's so heavy and long and big.
See, but the things that I was thinking about this armoured train, because it blows my mind that this would be the idea. I mean, you could just blow up the tracks, couldn't you? And then the train is stuck in position, and then whatever you want to do. The armour. The quality of the armour on the train is great. That's one thing. It's going to protect you inside this box.
Exactly,
but then you're stuck in the box when the track's all gone.
Well, what if the track blows up? Exactly. Well, then it's a bus replacement service.
Oh, the rail replacement. I've taken a few of those on a Sunday.
Bus replacement service to Beijing. There you are. Happens all the time.
Absolute nightmare. You'll never get there. You get there the next day. All right. I told you that I'd lighten the mood. So all that World War III talk. Let's move on to a question here from J. Keith 75, and it's going to segue us into talking about Ukraine as well. So we've talked about Kim Jong-un being in Beijing. After the meeting between Kim and Putin, are Russia to get more North Korean troops?
Nobody's confirmed that yet, but it is rumoured. I mean, the South Koreans are probably the best on this because you can imagine the South Korean intelligence is looking all the time at what's happening in Pyongyang, and so far they've proved to be pretty accurate. They don't exaggerate what they think is happening, and they say that they think that the North Koreans have stood by with about 30,000 troops that may be sent to Ukraine.
Yeah.
They also may be sent to secondary jobs, such as in the Tatarstan factory, where they're producing drones. I mean, there are a lot of foreign workers there. A lot of African women are said to be working in this Alabuga factory in Tatarstan. But the North Koreans have said that they would send people as well. Now, whether they would send civilians or military is a moot point. But we are waiting to see if North Koreans now turn up on the battlefront. Because if they do, they'll be turning up on the Ukrainian battlefront, which is different to turning up inside Russia to fight for Kursk, which is Russian territory that the Ukrainians had invaded last year as a sort of counterpunch. Now that the Russians have got all of Kursk back, any Ukrainians fighting in Ukraine would be fighting in a foreign country.
Yep.
And that technically would be a North Korean invasion of Ukraine. Would they do it? Yes, they probably would. Will they do it? I'm 50-50 about that at the moment. I suspect that they'll send people to Russia to backfill and to work on armaments, but we'll see.
To free up Russians to go into Ukraine to continue their invasion. You talked about it, technically being an invasion. Is that how it would be seen in international law? If an aggressor invites an ally in on their side in their invasion, and then that ally puts its own troops in another person's sovereign territory, it's an invasion.
That's right. I mean, what the Russians undoubtedly would say is that, well, we've annexed these territories of Ukraine that we've conquered. They're annexed, so they're Russian territory. So the Ukrainians are just fighting inside Russian territory. But nobody in the world would recognise that. And only that, I suppose the basket cases would, like say, in Cuba or in Venezuela. I mean, China would have an ambiguous attitude towards that, I think. I mean, this would be difficult. If the North Koreans exert themselves too much for Russia on the battlefield, I think China would have a problem with that, to be honest. Right. Because the Chinese are not entirely happy with the closeness between Putin and Kim Jong-un. Now, they've indicated by inviting Kim Jong-un to Beijing for these ceremonies that they will tolerate it. I think they've been smoothed over a little bit. But in general, they don't want Kim Jong-un as it were, completely moving over to be a client of Russia.
And I guess that decision as well would just be a further pulling apart of sort of international law as well, which takes us further down a
so Kamali, I mean, I talk to international lawyers quite a lot in the other things I do, and most international lawyers say international law is gone. It's finished. As a universal standard that was increasing all the time. And that was the case until about 20 years ago. It was increasing all the time, getting better and more mature. Well, that's gone. It's not that the world is completely lawless, but what we've got now is some parts of the world are more lawful than others. Some regions are. So Europe is still more lawful than many other parts of, say, Central Africa is very unlawful at the moment. And there are some functional areas like maritime law or copyright law or even world trade law, although it's been stretched at the moment by US tariffs. And so, but there are some functional areas where the law applies. But the idea of a sort of standard, a universal standard of international law is something of the past. Now, it might come back, but it's gone for the time being. We've got to think about the internationalization of law in a more disaggregated way. And that's what the legal specialists, I'm not a legal specialist, but that's what they tell me when I speak to them.
I suppose, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're going to get ourselves on a rabbit hole, but I suppose thinking of it in a disaggregated way means that it then just doesn't apply as we want it to apply when we say that this is wrong here, so it should be wrong over in this territory. If you think about it separately, then
much harder to maintain consistency in this situation, which is why the liberal democracies, the endangered species that we are, the 30 of us or so among 200 states, have got to hold on as hard as we can to the things we think are important. Really hold on. And maybe we've got to defend them. Maybe we've got to fight for them. Maybe.
You've been very optimistic today, Michael. I appreciate you. All right, move on to a question here from Carl G. With Russia intensifying its use of missiles in recent weeks, where are most of them being launched from? They did seem to slow down their use of missiles leading up to the Alaska summit, maybe stockpiling them, and then they went back with a vengeance a week or so later. Yeah,
what they're doing, Kamal, at the moment, I mean, this has been consistent now for about a month, is that the drone attacks are in the 400 to 500 on a nightly basis, and they're followed up with sometimes a dozen. I think last night it was 30 ballistic or cruise missiles. So it's usually it's a few hundred drones and then a few dozen missiles. Where they're being launched from? Well, all over the place. So the cruise missiles and some ballistic missiles can be launched from sea. So some of the submarines can launch them, Kilo-class submarines, and from some of their missile-launching ships, their frigates and their corvettes can launch them from the Black Sea. Now, they're not launching them from the western part of the Black Sea because they can't get there safely. So the Russian fleet is staying on the eastern part of the Black Sea, east of Sevastopol, but they can still launch from there. And then some are launched from aircraft. So the KH-101 standard cruise missile is usually launched from a Bison or a Bear aircraft, and they just sort of trundle around inside Russian airspace and then launch half a dozen missiles, whatever it is. And then the drones, usually they don't have to take off from any one place. I mean, the drones are normally launched from the backs of trucks. So the Shahed 136, and now the Russian version of it is the Shahed 238, which is Jiran 2, Geranium 2. And I think they're launched they were originally, the 136s were launched in batches of 5 from the back of a truck. And so what would happen is a truck would literally have look like 5 big paper aeroplanes on the back.
Wow.
All sort of pointed at 45 degrees, and then one by one they just send them off.
Launch off, okay.
The Jiran 2, I think, still launches in batches of 5, although I stand to be corrected on that.
Okay.
And you're looking at your PCs.
I am. So I was going to ask you about hypersonic missiles. No, sorry, I'll go back to that in a minute, because I was thinking about the hypersonic Kinzhal.
But the drones can be launched from more or less anywhere. So it isn't as if Ukraine can say there are half a dozen bases that we must hit to stop the drones being launched.
Yeah.
That's the issue, that they can be launched from lots of different places.
And this is what you and I were talking about before you guys joined us. They're able to launch as well over other territories. I mean, they launch over Poland, over Romania, you were saying, and over Moldova as well.
I mean, the Russians have launched ballistic missiles from their northern territory, their northern bases, which go over Poland. They've launched them from the Black Sea in the past, which go over Romania. And they don't really care. And of course, Belarus, a lot of them go over Belarus, but the Belarusians don't mind. I mean, they're part of the war.
Unbelievable. All right, question here from Calvin Healy. And I like this question, Calvin. It's very polite. It starts with a hi, Michael, and it ends with a thanks. So let's do the whole thing. Hi, Michael. Calvin. Considering that Russia is not in full control of Zaporizhzhia, could you explain how come the Ukrainian forces haven't attempted or indeed why they've not been able to retake the power plant in Zaporizhia. And then it's thanks Calvin. Thank you, Calvin.
Yeah, good question. No, it's a very good question, actually. I'm guessing now, but I think it's two reasons. One is that of the places where they need to concentrate their forces, this one is not such a high priority. Because they really want, it's the Donbass, which is the high priority, defending the Donbass, which is where the Russians are trying now to push the Ukrainians right out. But I think the second thing, and I think this is where Calvin's probably thinking himself on that question, where he's coming from, is that the danger of fighting for the nuclear power plant might actually lose Ukraine some support and might genuinely be dangerous. I mean, there are 6 reactors at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. They're all powered down, but they're still dangerous because they've got toxic material in there. They've still got to be cooled all the time, constantly. And there was worries when the dam was broken. Remember the...
Yes, the Molkova Dam, the one that
Kakova Dam. Thank you. I was trying to think of it myself. When the Kakova Dam was blown by the Russians, there was real worry that they would lose so much water from the river that they wouldn't be able to keep Zaporizhia cool enough, and then you'd be facing another type of Chernobyl problem. But it is dangerous, and there was a lot of discussion at the time. I remember that the Russians had placed charges around the reactors and would be prepared to blow them up and blame the Ukrainians if they attacked it. That was never tested, thankfully, and the IAEA inspected as best they could Zaporizhia, and they said that they thought it was possible that the Russians had placed charges, but they couldn't prove it. The Ukrainians claimed it, and they produced photographs which showed it. I'm not sure it did show it, but it was a bit 50-50. But I mean, I think that's the real reason. Yeah. One is that it's not a very high priority for Ukraine, given that they've got much bigger priorities. And two, it would be an inherently dangerous thing to do because the Russians might blow up the power station. I mean, they've proved that they don't care about the environmental damage. No. And if they thought they were going to lose it, they blow it up and create another Chernobyl and, let the world worry about that.
Yeah, an environmental, ecological disaster, which was threatened when that dam was blown as well. All right, question here from Andy G. Do you think Ukraine's strategy to hit Russian oil refining capacity is good? And what impact do you think it will have on the battlefield?
Well, it's good in the sense that it is working. The figures that I've been looking at recently is that 11% of Russia's refining capacity, this is refining oil into petroleum and petroleum products, has been affected. The Americans say 20%. I don't know where they get that figure from, but that's the figure that's been briefed by the United States, partly because they disapprove of these attacks. So they tend to exaggerate. They say, well, they've affected 20% of Russia's refining capacity. But the reason the Ukrainians are going for the refining capacity is because if they went for the oil export capacity, which they could, it would affect the price of oil.
Global markets
would react to that. It put the price of oil up, and that would be something the United States would not approve of. But this is something which only affects Russia internally. And indeed, petrol seems to be going short for the domestic market. Yep. The wholesale price of petrol, the wholesale price, has gone up by more than 55% since the beginning of this year. The retail price, last time I looked, had gone up about 11%, 10 or 11%. But the wholesale price increase must filter through to the Russian retail market at some point in the future, probably next year sometime. So the bottom line is that this is a successful campaign that the Ukrainians are conducting that is affecting the domestic economy. Will that directly affect the war? Probably not. Because, the Russian military stuff runs on diesel, not on petroleum as such. Okay. Although it'll have an effect on diesel production ultimately. But the Russian military will always get petrol. I mean, if petrol ran short in Russia, the Russian military isn't going to run short. The domestic market will suffer long before the military suffers.
And I suppose the thought would be if it were to get very serious, very restive at home, because people couldn't get hold of fuel, that would then filter through.
Exactly. It filters through to the war in the sense that it inconveniences and bothers the Russians and reminds the Russian population that this war has a cost to them as well. So it has an effect in that respect. But, does it stop the battlefield? No, it doesn't. We used to have this argument in strategic bombing during the Second World War. Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris as he was called, the Americans always wanted to bomb the German oil refineries and stop the flow of fuel. And Harris said, look, you can stop the flow of fuel, but I promise you the last drop of fuel, of German fuel, will go to the German military, not to industry. I think Harris was actually wrong about that. But he was right in principle that the military get first priority when things go short. So creating a domestic shortage actually has only a long-term effect on the war itself on the front lines.
We'll have to do another podcast on area bombing and the targeting of
Oh,
civilians.
don't get me started.
I won't get you started on that. But I will give viewers the details about gasoline prices in Russia. They have gone up 7% since early August, 32% since the start of the summer, 47% since January. So it's spiking. Whether or not that will have a material impact on the rest of the Russian economy and how
the Russian government keeps intervening in the domestic petrol market to stop the rises becoming too big. But eventually, these rises in the wholesale price of petroleum, which are based on forward contracts internally, that's got to filter through to the real economy sometime, one would guess, next year.
Okay, next question here. I'm looking forward to saying this since we've been talking. This is from Michael Clarke's biggest fan. It's not me, Michael. It's someone else. Someone who's been watching along.
Is that mother? Is that your mother?
Here it is. Here's the question. Is anything known about the welfare of Ukrainians who are living under occupied Russian aggression? Is it likely that there are war crimes being committed against them? What do we know about what's going on in the occupied territories?
Yes and yes is the answer. Yes, we do know, and yes, there are war crimes being committed. It's not getting a whole lot of coverage because, the world is looking at Gaza and at what's happening in Sudan and some other, absolutely miserable situations in the world. And the war itself in Ukraine, goes on, has a different sort of agenda because it's more dramatic in a way. But what we know about what's happening in the occupied areas is quite considerable. So one thing that's happening is still children are being taken away. Officially, the Ukrainians have got a list of, they say, up to 20,000 children. Mm-hmm. The UN says that they think it's 35,000 that they can prove. They've got names and identities, and it's likely to be a lot higher than that. Very few have come back. A few have, and they make very interesting, heart-rending stories. But there are tens of thousands of children being taken away into Russia and brought up as Russians.
Well, that's the reason why...
That's a war crime, full stop.
That's why he's got the ICC warrant out against
him. Exactly. The ICC warrant against Putin is on that basis because that's what they can pin on him. Mm-hmm. The rest of the war is quite hard to pin on the boss, the chief. You've got to produce... Can you produce an order where he said, do this or do that, right on the battlefield? Very hard. But this one is something that goes direct to him. So they did him on that one, or at least they've accused him on that because they're pretty sure that will stick. So the removal of children is one. Two is trying to remove Ukrainian identity by replacing books in schools, by creating a different version of the history of Ukraine. That again that's a war crime. I mean that's ethnic cleansing of a certain sort. And then thirdly, there is a sort of brutal policing regime for anyone they think who obviously they think is either working for the Ukrainians, providing intelligence to Ukraine, and there are some very brutal retaliations. And of course, there are some assassinations inside occupied territories of Russian officials, and those assassinations always bring a degree of retribution to a wide range of people who might or might not have known the person involved or been associated in some way. So yes, I mean, inside the territories, life is absolutely miserable. And there are, as far as we know, we're never quite sure about the numbers, but it looks as if there's about 6 or 7 million Ukrainians living inside the occupied territories.
Significant number.
Out of the 42 million to start with, about 6 million are in occupied territories. 3 million are displaced abroad, and I think another 5 million are displaced internally.
And we hear so little from them. There's no reporting from within those territories, as far as I can see, really, that gives a proper insight as to what's happening.
I mean, effectively, Ukraine have lost about 10 million people to those inside the occupied territories, and those have gone abroad. Yeah. I mean, some of it, are women and children have been evacuated abroad. Some have fled abroad, I have to say. So essentially, a country of 42 million at the beginning of invasion is now a country of about 33 million, effectively. And that's one of the reasons why Ukraine's got a problem in recruiting enough soldiers, why they've got a problem of numbers, and also why it's very, very hard for them to hold elections.
Yeah, absolutely. You probably mentioned it as well, but just to reinforce that point, Ukraine suggests that 20,000 children have been taken by Russia.
Yeah, they say it used to be 19. They say it's now 20. Yeah. But the UN says 35,000.
It's incredible. And the charge against Putin is the unlawful deportation and transfer of children.
So systemic war crimes is what we're talking about. Yeah.
All right. Last few questions, Michael. Appreciate you sticking with us through all of this. Right. Now, question here about Europe and Putin's designs on it. Why is there so much hysteria? It's a question here from Andy over a possible attack on Europe, and Russia's barely succeeding in Ukraine, and there's clearly no match for NATO.
Is Andy?
Andy.
Oh. Well, Andy, I don't think it's hysteria. It is what is known in government as a reasonable worst-case scenario.
Prepare for the worst.
That's right, yeah. I do these things all the time in some of the other stuff I do. It's WRCS, it's called. You see it in the documents, the WRCS. What is the reasonable worst-case scenario? So not an absolute a worst case. I mean, the total worst case is that the Martians have landed and nobody can find Bruce Willis or something like that. A reasonable worst-case scenario is how bad could it get within the scope of our present imagination. So reasonable worst-case scenario. And what people are working through is the reasonable worst-case scenario for the future of Russian behaviour. And what they observe, it's not. I don't think it is hysteria, but it's a series of factors. One is we know what Putin has said, and people around him have said, about Russia's ambitions in the Baltics, in the Scandinavian countries, in southeastern Europe. They talk about the recreation of Russia's imperial territories, as well as restoring influence within the old Soviet empire, which covers Central Asia as well. I mean, northern Kazakhstan in particular, and Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were those territories too. So we know what they've said. We know that they've got an army which used to be about 250,000 regular army, relatively small actually, which is being expanded to 1.5 million. So it's going up 4 to 5 times the size. That's just the army, not the armed forces. They used to have armed forces of about just over 1 million, of which the army was about 250,000. Now the army itself, just the army, is going up to well over 1 million.
Right.
So we're talking about an army that's going to be 4 times larger. We're talking about an army that's mobilised. So if the war in Ukraine came to an end this week, the Russians have got a real problem. What are they going to do with this army? Are they going to send it all home, send everybody home with weapons and cash and
training,
looking for work and looking for something to do? And then we've got the sense of momentum. The whole economy has been turned into a war economy, and it's creaking as a war economy. But you can't just turn it. You can't turn it on and off like a tap. So we know that if the war in Ukraine came to an end, let's guess, or a ceasefire next year, then you've got a big army with a big economy behind it that's converted to a war economy, an aggressive leader who has a sense of destiny, who thinks that momentum is on his side, and who has said repeatedly that I will have all of Ukraine. He's said that, and he's also said, as we've mentioned before, as he said at the Petersburg Economic Forum, wherever the Russian soldier treads is Russian territory. That's the view he takes. So, I mean, all of that may be an overstatement, but, Andy, we're talking here about the interpretation of evidence. It's not hysteria. It is looking at the evidence and saying, well, what is the reasonable worst-case analysis? And scenario, reasonable worst-case scenario. And the view that Western countries now take, NATO takes, is we've got to be prepared to fight a real war against Russia, because only by being prepared are we likely to avoid it. That's deterrence. If we play with the words but don't do anything, then the reasonable worst-case scenario will probably play itself out. If we make ourselves genuinely able to hold off Russia in a major war, chances are, overwhelmingly, we won't have to.
Yes,
that's the thing.
One would hope, and as Andy probably points out, no match.
As they always say, if you want peace, prepare for war. That's an old one. And the other one is, if you look as if you're ready to fight, chances are you won't have to.
Let's hope. And also, Putin has told us much about what he planned to do for many, many decades, and perhaps people have not listened quite well enough, and that's the lessons being learned.
He began to say these things. I mean, we know he thought these things a lot, and he was shocked. He was really shocked by what happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union just went out of business overnight. It took him a long time to get over that. He was viscerally shocked and saddened and angered by it. And in 2007, he began to talk in the terms that have become very familiar to us.
Yeah.
We didn't take him very seriously then, because we thought, well, he doesn't like it, so what? The world is moving in our direction, we thought. Remember? The end of history,
Absolutely.
all of that. And the thing, he said this in 2007. 2008 is the invasion of Georgia, but also 2008 is the Western economic crisis. Remember, the big economic, from which we have only just started to recover, and we have not recovered our moral authority. That crisis knocked us, drove a coach and horses through Western self-confidence.
Okay, and Western hypocrisy as well, in the way that we behaved in terms of bailing out the banks and leaving poor people to just lose everything.
Exactly. The 2008 crisis, you can't underestimate how much damage it did. And before 2008, there was a sort of sense that, an underlying sense that had gone for over a century. Only the liberal democracies are really prosperous. If you want to be rich, you really need to be a liberal democracy. Freedom, individual freedom, entrepreneurship, ability to do things, opportunity. The 2008 crisis knocked us back so far that within 10 years, the view was, well, actually, the autocracies are doing better than you, aren't they? And you look at growth rates in the world, the Western world is growing at about 2 to 3% maximum, which is historically what we're always growing at in the 19th century. Yeah. The autocratic world and the fast developers, more risky, they grow at 5 and 6 and 7%. Incredible. And so the point is the 2008 crisis really did us real, not just economic damage, but political damage. And that coincides with Putin's explicit statements that Russia has had a bad deal with a victim. We've got to restore Russia's greatness. It's not a coincidence.
No, absolutely not.
I just said it coincides. It's not a coincidence. I'm sorry about that. But it is not a coincidence. It's actually a correlation. That's what I mean.
You're being watched by your biggest fans. Everyone's going to forgive you that one. Don't worry about that. Final question here. As a former director of the Royal United Services, this comes from Kevin, who asks, as a former director of RUSI, what have you made of Russia's announcement to ban them from operating within Russia? I wonder, I mean, you could probably give us an anecdote about last time you went and like when you worked at... Really? Yeah. Okay, go on.
The thing about RUSI was that neither the Russians nor the Chinese ever believed that we were independent.
You were always an arm of the States.
Yeah, because we were close to... I mean, we were just behind the MOD and we're opposite Downing Street. I used to have the best office in London, literally looking out on Downing Street and so on. RUSI is totally independent, gets no money from government unless it's for a particular contract or project, gets no core money from government. Everything it does is independently funded. And it's such a British sort of arrangement, an institute which is close to government, not paid for by government, but which actually has the ability to operate in government as well as in the wider world. Yeah. And because they don't exist in Russia or China, they always assume that we were a front for spies. Yeah. They assume we were an intelligence front because in those countries we would have been, but we weren't. So, and it always amused me how the Russians and the Chinese used to follow us around, and they all assumed that we were spies.
I think we'll do another one of these about some of your time at RUSI, because I'm sure the viewers will be very, very interested to hear some of your anecdotes from that time. We've gone on 40 minutes, Michael. It's been a pleasure, as always, talking to you. Thank you very much for all of your questions, and let our schedules align, and we'll make sure we can do one of these again next week. Professor, thanks so much. See you soon. Thank you.